Welcome to Ripstop on the Record, the podcast for makers, by makers, where we talk about all things MYOG. Brought to you by Ripstop by the Roll. I think it's good, right?
Yeah, I think that was a good take.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in space and time. Hey everyone, welcome to Ripstop on the Record. I'm Jameson.
And I'm Avery.
On this episode, we are talking with Martin Hoy, a prolific at-home maker from the wonderful country of Germany. This is our latest addition to our ever-growing how-to series, where we're going to be focusing on how to make a down quilt at home.
Stay tuned to hear about material selection, what type of down you should use, how to sew baffles, and patterning tips for your first quilt.
So, although this episode is all about how to make a quilt, some people are not willing to take on a project of that scale. And I completely understand this because that's kind of what I've just done. So if you don't want to make a quilt, then make sure you get your quilt from a trusted cottage company like UGQ. So I do want to give them a very honest and genuine shout out here. I just received a brand new 20-degree bandit quilt that I got from UGQ, and it's amazing. I trust my making skills. And as you'll hear in the episode, I've never made anything with down. So for this particular project, I wanted to outsource. And I'm really, really excited about this quilt. I got an ounce of overstuff with 850. I got a sewn foot box. I got it extra wide. Well, like normal wide, normal length because I'm not that tall. But yeah, all those features that you can customize with their selections there on the site. I also got it made with Mem 10 and Mem 7 as the outside and the inside. So I'm just really elated. So if you listen to this episode and you're like, I don't know if down is in my future, completely respectable. That's been me up to this point as well. Just make sure you get it from a good place where you know you're getting a really good product through and through. And for me, that was UGQ for my quilt. So I just want to give them a very hearty shout out. Please go check them out. If you are in the budget or in the looking for a quilt whatsoever, then go check them out. That's where I personally chose to get mine. It's ugqoutdoor.com.
And it's not only Jameson getting new things around here. This week at Ripstop by the Roll, we released XLPE foam. It's a new product that's already been really well received in its short time. It's a staple in our makerspace, and it's also great for shoulder straps, hip belts, bike bags, padded cases, and anything you need to add structure and padding to.
Carter had me product test this, Avery, a while ago, and I'm maybe a little bit embarrassed to say how much stuff I've already made with this foam, but
Nice.
Just top of my mind, I have made shoulder straps, a hip belt, like a backpack with like that's the back panel, a valet tray, and 3 bike bags, I think, with 4 bike bags with it so far. So
Wow.
It's a good foam. If you're doubting this, then I would pretty much just say make it. And also, this is something I'm going to keep in the makerspace at all times now. This is a new staple, so you should have it.
If you're wondering why we chose the XLPE foam, you can go onto our Instagram and to that post that we've posted, and our product manager has answered that question for you. If you're curious, why did Ripstop bring on XLPE and not a different foam? Well, we've got an answer for you, and that answer is on Instagram.
Yes, I saw that. Those are helpful answers from Carter. Also, it's officially fall now, which it means the sales season is in full swing. Starting September 23rd, just I think in the past for this episode, and going until September 30th, we are running our holiday readiness sale. This is for all B2B customers. Use your unique discount code in the email to get 20% off site-wide, as well as check out full rolls. Those prices are already reflected on the website. So you can get discounts on pretty much anything if you're a B2B, if you're a company. So go check that sale out right now.
And if you're not a B2B customer, then don't worry. We are running our annual sale at the end of October, and that's for everyone, included DIYers. Everything on the site will be on sale, from Dyneema, outdoor ink, components, and everything in between. Stay tuned to our Instagram and our emails for more information in the upcoming weeks.
One last thing. Please follow us on your favorite platforms, whether that's Instagram, YouTube, your favorite podcast platform like Spotify or Apple. It really means a lot to see more people subscribing and downloading, but it also helps other people find the show. We don't run like Patreon or anything like that. I'm fine with that, just not where we are as a company. So maybe consider a rating, your kind of way of showing your support for us. If you're on Apple, then click on the show, scroll down to the point where you see reviews, and then click on the star that's to the far right, just whatever one's on the farthest right, go ahead and click that. No, but give us an honest review and let us know how you like the episode. I was actually just reading reviews before this episode, and kind of warmed my heart. I haven't read them in a while, so I really appreciate those people that have given us a shout out and just listen in general. So let other makers find the episode, or the people that are interested. Yeah, just let us know what you think. All right, let's get on to the episode. If you have been following the podcast for a while, then you're likely familiar with our how-to series of episodes. These are episodes where we talk about a specific project and we go on a deep dive to talk about the materials, construction, features, components, and things like that, all for one project. Today, we're taking a deep dive into the world of quilts. Now, this is an area where I have extremely limited experience. Out of all the things that I've made, I've actually never worked with down at all. So this is where we need to have some help and find someone else with that experience to bring us on.
Today we have Martin, who is a dentist by day and a maker by night. He's made all sorts of great pieces. If you follow him on Instagram, Montmoller, and he's made things like packs, shelters, and apparel. Today we're talking to him because he has a lot of experience with working down and his projects. So welcome to the podcast today, Martin, and thank you for joining us.
Yeah, I'm happy to be here and happy to answer the questions as best as I can.
Yeah. Working with down is difficult. For those listening, if you have worked with it or haven't worked with it, most of us know that as a general truth. It's more than just a simple project. There's a lot of working pieces there. So can you talk about why someone might want to make a down quilt?
Yeah, well, obviously, down is still the best in terms of warmth to weight ratio, I suppose, because there have been quite a lot of developments in the synthetic world and synthetic insulation, but down is still, unbeaten, so to speak. So I guess if you're really up to totally maximize what you will get out of your garment or your quilt, I suppose there's no way around down today. Yeah.
Quilts often start with the material, right? We kind of start with the fabric side because that's the side that's touching our bodies, and that's going to be maintaining some of this warmth to weight ratio. And quilts are often separated into like an outer and an inner. You can get something that's lighter on the inside and more durable on the outside and stuff like that, or choose colors. When you're making a quilt, what are some things that you look for in those outer and inner materials?
Yeah, well, first of all, definitely needs to be downproof because, well, yeah, I made the mistake in the past to have a material that wasn't really fitted for that purpose, and yeah, it was a little bit messy after a while. So yeah, definitely make sure it's downproof, and the rest kind of depends on what you're looking for. So I personally have used basically all the lightest materials available in that regard from you guys, the Membrane 7, and some European material types as well. And they all work perfectly fine, that's for sure. And the differences are quite nuanced. So I personally don't think that it really needs to be ripstop. A taffeta will work as well, in my opinion. And well, if you want it more durable, you can always go higher denier, but I had great experience with the really low denier 170s. They are really durable today. So I've had them on my hike to the Everest base camp in the mountains when I'm bivouacking. So they will really hold. So so it all works today.
Yeah, that was actually my next question. I have sewn with the Membrane 7, the Membrane 10s some, and I've made some synthetic insulation projects. But that was one thing I have noticed a lot of people say or kind of ask. It's like, hey, like once you get down to the Mem 7, Mem 10, like isn't there a significant durability problem? So I'm glad that you mentioned that. The other side of materials that a lot of people choose to do is something that's a lot more durable on the outside.
Mm.
What are some times when you think that it is more worth it to add a thicker material on the outside, and when do you feel like it's just not worth the wait?
Well, I suppose if you're not going to take so much care of your equipment, or if you're doing like cowboy camping a lot, where the quilt will be exposed and maybe rubbing on the floor, in the worst case, I suppose it's wise to choose a more durable outer material. Yeah, but I suppose that would be the main reason, because other than that, as I said, I didn't notice too much of a downside with going the lighter ones.
We're going to get mostly into talking about down, but what are some instances for people that may not be as familiar about the pros and cons of down versus synthetic insulation? How do you go about choosing using like an Apex Climate Shield or using
Mm.
Primaloft versus a down base?
Yeah, that's a good point, because I think, first of all, you need to think about basically, will this insulation get wet in any sort of way that will like really degrade the insulating properties? So especially when I'm ice climbing, for example, I will rather choose the synthetic one, because there will be water spray, there will be some dew on the jacket all the time, and down will just fail in that instance. Even the impregnated downs, they will collapse after a while if they are just susceptible in that wet environment for too long. Whereas when you're going with a quilt, for example, that will stay in a tent, and even with moderate condensation, you can't go wrong with down in that regard, because it's not enough to saturate the down essentially. Yeah.
That makes sense. Do you notice a breathability difference with materials that are calendared and are downproof versus, like, I've heard some people ask, and because my experience is a little bit more limited, I don't always
Mm.
know, but some people ask kind of, hey, if we use a synthetic insulation, then we can use a more breathable material that's not calendared, and isn't that going to breathe better in the quilt? Yeah, and what do you think? What do you think about that, and how do you see the downproof material altering your breathability for the quilt?
Well, if you're thinking about apparel, it definitely makes sense to think about stuff like mono light, for example, to use instead of a regular outer or inner layer, because you can even make some fancy active insulation pieces with that, like kind of the more beefy alpha versions, if you make a jacket out of it, for example, because it definitely will breathe less with a calendar downproof fabric in regards or compared with like a monolite or like a really tiny mesh. And so I don't think it would be really wise to go with such a breathable layer for a quilt, for example, because you want to have kind of all the insulation you can get for the weight. But for an apparel, for example, you may be inclined to use something breathable if you're going with a synthetic insulation material, if you want it for really active pursuits where you're maybe like hiking all the time and you're sweating and you just want to take the edge of the kind of dampness on your body, and that will work really well. So yeah, comparable to alpha.
Yeah, that is a really good point. That in the quilt, you want some breathability, so you don't soak your quilt with condensation and stuff, but you also don't, like, you want to trap the heat. Like, you don't want just stuff like
Yeah.
leaving. Now
Yeah,
on the
so
flip
of course
side,
you don't want to use some. I mean, I've thought about using DCF for a quilt back in the days, because if the 0.34 ounces DCF, you could make it like really light, but where do you get the breathability at all? It will be a vapor barrier, and it wouldn't work in most cases, and it would just be unnecessary a hassle, so to speak. Yeah.
that was the next place I was going to go. Is I've heard the people on the other side, which is, like, hey, like, why don't we just, instead of having a bivy and having a quilt, why don't I just make my quilt have a waterproof layer on the outside with a
Mhm.
breathable inner, but like have something like a membrane sill poly on the outside of the quilt, so that then my quilt's waterproof and that'll protect the down. And to your point, like, that becomes a vapor barrier, and now there's more moisture trapped inside your quilt, right?
Yeah, I mean, if you want to go down that route, you definitely need something that is like breathable still. So like maybe something like a membrane type of material that has a, what's it called, like an event or something material. So it's this still waterproof but still breathable, kind of, because other than that you will just have condensation all over the place. And even though in that regard, it's still like kind of narrows the field you can use this quilt to such an extent that I personally think it's more wise to go the route. You have a quilt and you may have a bivy, which you can combine if you need it, or you can still use the quilt as is if you're going with a regular tent, or if you're going like nice weather, like today in Germany, it's sunny again, so you could just come cowboy camping and don't need to bring all the extra stuff. So yeah, I think it's better to have it modular.
Sure. No, that makes a ton of sense. Now, we carry something called Hyperdry down here, which is a proprietary nanotechnology water-resistant coating that coats the down clusters so that it's supposed to make the down clusters more waterproof than they would be on their own. How do you feel like Hyperdry or treated down has impacted the efficacy of down when it's wet?
I think it's really amazing to what extent treated down does perform differently in regards or compared to regular down. It really makes a difference. It's not quite there yet with the synthetic ones. As I mentioned before, like too much spray, too much dampness will still affect the down to some extent at least. But yeah, I've been actually using not Hyperdry to be honest, but from a Polish company called Cumulus. They're treated down for all my quilts, and I've been really happy with them so far. So
it is worth reminding people. Martin, you have some access to some interesting things being based in Europe that we don't. I mean, we could get access to, I guess, but because we work at Ripstop of the Roll, and there are other companies in America that carry things. You probably have some interesting products, like you mentioned that down from the Polish company that I haven't even heard of. So that's pretty neat. Do you see stuff in Europe that we don't have at Ripstop of the Roll that you don't see available in America?
I mean, it goes both ways. There's like definitely some stuff you guys carry, and I mean, I've ordered from you a ton because I just can't get it anywhere else around here. And on the contrary, I mean, like as I said with the Polish down, I mean, it's a neighboring country. They have a really high quality down in that regard, and I suppose there are some companies carrying that amount of. I mean, I can say it's 900 fill power down, so in European standards. And I suppose there is some companies in the US as well that carry this high quality down, but yeah, it's not as widely available, I guess, because it's still a niche and also not quite as cheap product, to be honest. Hmm. Yeah, I mean, for the easiest, I would always recommend starting with a synthetic quilt, honestly, because it's just a bunch easier in comparison. You just have your sheet of synthetic insulation, two pieces of of shell material, stitch it all around, and you're done, kind of. But there will be, of course, some phase in your make your own gear journey where you're just not as good in the beginning, and it's wise to not choose the most high tech materials for your first projects because you just need to get the feeling for the materials and how it will work in your machine because not all of those like 7D materials, for example, will work just as easy in your sewing machine. So it's always wise to start with something maybe a little bit heavier, maybe a little bit thicker, because it just makes the whole process easier to start with.
Yeah. For people listening that may be interested in starting with a quilt sometime soon, some of the heavier calendared materials that we have are like 1.1 ounce ripstop nylon calendared. There's a 1 ounce Hyper D calendared. There's an eco poly ripstop calendared as well. Those are some of the quote heavier materials. You know, the Mem 7, the 0.56 membrane 7, the membrane 10 they're phenomenal materials, but they are so silky. Having some technique and maybe some
Yeah, for sure. Because it's a journey with everything you're doing, like sewing and making your own stuff. You just I mean, you may be gifted. There may be some folks, but other than that, it's just a learning curve to it, and it's wise to not go spend all your money on the fancy stuff right at the beginning and then think, well, what did I create here? I can't use it at all. Because there will be some mistakes. I mean, I guess all of us have made some and made the next version after that better.
Thanks for sharing all that information with us and choosing materials. I know that's the first big step, and now we're going to move on to sizing and design, which is crucial and also very opinionated. Everyone has their own preference in certain quilt aspects or quilt features that they're going to make. But first, sizing is super important in all projects, but it's really important in making your own quilt. No one wants a quilt that's too small or too big. So how do you size a quilt properly to the size of your own body?
Yeah, that's a tricky one. I mean, I personally did it the way I had a sleeping bag from a different company in the past, and I just used it for reference. So kind of I was laying inside it and thought, okay, how is the spacing to the sides, to the length? Am I fine with it? Turning around and everything. I mean, I've slept in it a bunch before, so I knew what I had to work with. And going from there, so you have a reference point for your own body, because it's hard to just say like I'm 180, just go with this length. Or I think it's better to just get a feel on the object you want to make. In the worst case, you may have a friend or someone who already has a quilt, and maybe just try using that as a reference guide for the length you want to have your project made, because it just makes it easier to really see the object instead of just thinking on a blank page of paper. It's easier in the living thing, so to speak.
No, that definitely makes sense. I wasn't even thinking like use another quilt to reference. I was just thinking like we're starting from scratch. But I did a little bit of research on my own, just interested in quilts to prep for this podcast. And I did find a great resource I wanted to share with the listeners. And you've probably seen it as well on Reddit, but Dubber Designs has a Down Quilt pattern generator. So it's really great that when makers put out generators like that, it really helps other makers in their process. So I'll link that in the show notes if anyone's curious and wants to check that out. But I know that's been a resource that's been passed around a lot on Reddit.
I've seen it as well, and I think I've dabbled with it in the past. But well, if you have your size set, you're basically set for life, I guess, because once you have the quilt as you want it, you don't need to like change it at all. So I've actually made a pattern myself, like around here, which I'm using for my quilts. Yeah, that's been working fine for me at least.
I'm curious to know what you made your pattern out of. Is that cardboard or?
Yeah, it's just a piece of cardboard, just a big old piece of cardboard. I've folded it so I can stow it away better. But
nice.
Yeah, I have kind of all the measurements and everything. I've put it on the cardboard, and so I can always reference it when I'm doing a new one, and know the size will be just perfect, kind of.
Yeah, that's great. If you're listening to this and not watching, you can go to YouTube and see his little cardboard pattern that he has. That looks really neat. Cool. There's a lot of different footbox and collar options out there. We have like a drawstring footbox, a sewn-in footbox, a zippered footbox. You can do snaps. What do you recommend for someone who is making their first quilt? What type of footbox to go with?
I guess for your first quilt, kind of going with button snaps, for example, would be really easy, because you can arrange them after the fact and just put some cam snaps in there. That makes it like the easiest, because I personally think a zipper is kind of finicky, especially with the lighter materials, and also rather heavy for the purpose. So I've personally done a lot of drawstring footboxes, because you can have a sort of double use with a quilt. You can still make it open for more ventilation. You can wear it kind of like trousers sort of thing. If you want to chill out at camp, I've made a picture on Reddit about that, how you can like make it kind of wearable, but that's sort of tricky sometimes, because how you position the drawstring will determine if you really can get to cinch the footbox really tight, or if there will be a little gap, which will continuously be annoying, because there will be some draft or some coldness seeping through. So I guess that's also a little bit tricky for the first project. So I guess just cam snaps will be rather easy, because you can always put more in if you want to make it close, even tighter, and they don't weigh next to nothing. So
that's a great suggestion. I'll have to look at your pictures to see your wearable quilt. That sounds really fantastic. Not to go backwards, but you mentioned how working with these light fabrics can be a little more challenging. They're a little more slippery. Do you have any suggestions or any tricks for people who are sewing these slippy materials?
yeah, I suppose try to get yourself a nice flat area. Like if you can manage to get everything out of your living room and put it on the floor, so to speak. Number one, for cutting it in the form you want, because I mean it will at least be taller than your height, so we will need some room to really cut it out precisely. For sewing, I mean, yeah, you just have to take your time, not to finagle with the fabric, not to get it like scrunched under the needle, or have it make some loops or some funky moves. So just take your time, sew a little bit slower maybe than what you would do on a pack, for example. Just that the material will always go like smoothly without any waves or any imperfections. So
that's a great suggestion, just to go a little bit slower, because those materials they can kind of like slip around on you and move and have a mind of their own. And it can definitely be frustrating for people. I know some of the tips that we will give people is sewing it on top of a page of newspaper that's supposed to grip a little bit more with the feed dogs. Tissue paper, I don't think people are buying paper as much anymore since we're getting our news online. But yeah, a little sheet of tissue paper or something is supposed to help add a little more grip to your project, to the fabric.
yeah, and
so
also if you have like a machine with a walking foot, it will really help. So I mean, if you can manage to get one of those, it makes the process so much easier. So yeah.
For sure. Thanks for those tips. I know that those are like little nuggets of gold in the conversation for people to get. So this might be a little bit repetitive to the first question, but do you have any tips on sizing your quilt to your sleeping bag, or to your sleeping pad specifically? Or are you just going off of, I mean, usually our sleeping pad is a little bit bigger than our body. So if you're measuring it to your body, then you should be okay for it to lay on your sleeping pad. Is that right?
Yeah, pretty much. Because
Okay.
To make it short, pretty much. If you made it to your body, I mean, it will probably work with your pad as well, especially if you like kind of using pad straps to keep it in place on the pad, and then you will be fine.
Nice. I have a question about your preference. What do you prefer when it comes to footbox options?
Yeah, as I stated before, I like to have it with this drawstring
Okay.
closure. So I just have it kind of modular, and if it's really warm out, I can have it a little bit open for some cooling effect. And I've actually worn the quilt, as I said, in the past, like when you're chilling in camp, still waiting for nighttime, so to speak. And it has a double use in this case. So it's quite nice.
I love that. One final question I have about design and sizing is the thought of a false bottom quilt. I learned this from Sarah Quackenbush, who was one of our maker sponsors, and she made a false bottom quilt, and it blew my mind. So is that something that you've dabbled with? And can you tell the listeners what a false bottom quilt is? Because when I heard that word, I was like, I don't know what that means.
Yeah, it's a really great concept. Shout out to Dan Timmerman, or Timmermate, like Timmermate is his company at least, um, because I think he was the first to introduce the concept into the ultralight space. It basically means that you have a piece of the shell material on your back, so to speak, like not filled with down, not filled with anything insulation at all, but just a fabric piece at the back. So you still have a little bit of enclosure at the back, and when you're turning around in the quilt and you maybe like lift it up slightly to one side, you don't feel the draft as much because there's still a sort of barrier function. I find it a neat idea. I personally didn't need to use it so far, as I never had that problem, to be honest, because yeah, like even when I'm turning and tossing around in my quilt, I didn't feel too much of a draft to be bothered. So yeah, I just skipped that part. But it's a neat idea for anyone who's having trouble or is maybe a little bit more active in their sleep. So it is a nice like compromise between a fully enclosed sleeping bag, so to speak, and a quilt that is just barely open at the back.
Yeah, I love the idea of that. And I think I definitely see what you're saying. You haven't had a need for it because your quilts have been wide enough that when you're rolling around, you're not getting that draft. But I can definitely see myself maybe like designing a winter quilt that's 0 degrees with a false bottom. That way, when we're out winter camping or whatever, you don't have to worry about that draft. Because I've been in some pretty cold conditions on the Appalachian Trail, and I was always like, my back is so cold. Like I have a wide quilt too, and I could just never, there's
No, I
always
get it.
little
That's it.
spots
Yeah,
of drafts. But yeah, thanks for sharing your knowledge on design and sizing.
you're welcome.
So a few minutes ago, we were talking about how you want to get as much space as possible to kind of like lay these big panels out, and especially for these lighter materials because they are a bit slippery, but also they don't grip the scissors as well. So marking and cutting can also be a little bit of a hassle. Do you have any tips for people that are making their quilts at home for how they can get nice, even, straight cut lines, but then also what they would use to mark these materials? Like, do you use chalk or a pencil or a marker or something like that? What do you use for marking and then cutting these panels?
Let me just see. I've got it around here. I have one of those little trick markers actually to mark them. So it's a special ink that will like delete after some time, basically. Because I've used chalk in the past, but once you like take up the material and fiddle around with it and get it to the sewing machine, it may like dust off and you don't see the lines as clearly anymore, especially for the baffles. And so the trick marker has been my go-to for marking fabrics of any kind. And to do that, as I said, I use the large living room area and basically tape the material I'm working with, the fabric, to the ground with some just some regular old tape so it will stay put. Then I go around, mark it on my pattern, and so it won't like move in any direction. It will stay on the ground fixed, and you have it a little bit easier to then cut it afterwards or have it prepared for the sewing machine afterwards, because you can really make sure everything's on point before you take it off the ground and to the machine.
I want to talk about your pattern piece there, the cardboard right behind you, because that is for something that size. Normally, I don't think about creating a pattern for it, but for people making at home that may want to make sure they save some time and money and not potentially waste any material, that's a really good idea. So, what did you like? I guess what is that cardboard cutout representing? Is that one panel that you would cut out, or
Yeah, for
how do
sure.
people build that?
Correct. It's representing like the inner or outer panel,
Okay.
and especially like the outlines for one, of course, like the upper line, the sides, and here's the bottom part that's still flipped in. And I've also have all the baffle segments on this cardboard piece,
Okay.
because I mean the outer lining is rather easy to get when you just, like I said before, have your reference quilt or reference sleeping bag. You can like think about when you fold it open, how how wide will it be, so to speak, and you use the outer edge with some extra for the sewing allowance, and just draft it on the cardboard box, so to speak. But the baffles will be more finicky to get and to get right. And so I guess, if you're preparing with a little bit more time, you have it easier afterwards and a more cleaner finished project, so to speak.
Yeah. No, that makes a ton of sense. We have this roll of paper in the makerspace that's right next door, and it's totally revolutionized my making because I finally start patterning things first. It's always like been my biggest problem in the past that I don't think enough about it beforehand and kind of draw it out. Um, and I feel like your cardboard piece is exactly that, but such a really good at home version for people where anyone
Mm.
there's cardboard everywhere. I mean, you can just pick it up at like Walmart just gives you cardboard boxes if you want to. So you can go get cardboard anywhere and kind of make this pattern piece. So I guess that's maybe the biggest tip I've heard yet for people is make this pattern piece at home, like make it out of paper. If you can get really big sheets of paper or cardboard or something and really start to scope it out. Cause I think you'll be able to conceptualize the design in your head before you have to do it. And that'll help a ton. And then also to your point about laying it down, laying that cardboard piece on top of the material itself will give you much cleaner lines than trying to like freehand draw it all out.
Totally. Yeah, it just can go around the border with the pen, and it's really easy that way.
Yeah. So another construction related question that, because I've never made anything with Down, I really don't know how this works at all, is how do you sew baffles? Like, how do you get the baffles in between two layers of materials? That blows my mind.
Yeah, it is also one of the most tricky parts, especially in apparels, because you have to think in advance how you will sew it together, because you can't, kind of undo it afterwards. So for the quilts, for example, it's obviously makes sense to start with the bottom or the foot end and then work your way upwards or downwards, because it doesn't make sense to start somewhere in the middle. And for apparels, it takes quite a bit more thinking how you're gonna sew those pieces on one side, like maybe the outer one at first, and then like kind of match the inner piece to it, so it will really have the same position in space, so to speak. And that's kind of tricky. So what I personally found to help with that is using what I call partial baffles, which is a concept I've not seen anywhere before. Like it's kind of based on the Caro step quilts, if that does sound familiar. So it's not a complete baffle that will run through the entire length of the quilt or the garment, but rather pieces of baffles, which have some gaps in between. And I personally find it makes working with it a little bit easier, because you don't have this long piece of baffle material you have to sew, but rather tiny pieces you can just puzzle together, so to speak. But it takes a little bit more work up front, because you really have to think, how many pieces do I need? How will I make the spacing? But that's how I go about constructing Down. A little bit different than the norm, I guess.
The partial baffle makes sense in my head because one of the things that's been really throwing me off about how to work with baffles is that it changes how we think about finishing a project. At least when I started making everything, like you sew it inside out, you flip it out to get the final project. And with baffles, that's what really threw me off, because you can't just flip it inside out. Like the baffles, you have to sew it to two layers. You can't. There's nothing to flip inside out.
Totally.
So that makes sense with the partial baffle, because I was thinking about the edge, where if you sew your baffle, if you think about a perpendicular line that goes across two materials, you don't have an edge to work with as much. So I'm imagining with the partial baffle, it gives you a decent amount of space in between where the baffle ends and the edge for you to kind of tuck the raw edge under and then run a stitch along. Is that how you do it, at least?
Yeah, exactly. So
Okay.
it makes, like, depending on how much space you will leave, it makes it rather easy to work the edge and finish it neatly. So you can even like have it really tightly folded inwards, so to speak, and make a clean look to the outside. So I found personally it helps in that regard as well, and in filling, but that's a different topic.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. So, in a lot of quilts, you see people run baffles horizontally and vertically to the quilt, up and down,
Mm.
sideways. Do you have a preference, and do you feel like it matters which way the baffles are running?
Yeah, I suppose it does matter definitely. I mean, there are many camps, I suppose, for each concept of baffling. There's even I guess, Loco Libre does them, the like horizontal, like not horizontal, the zigzag ones, which are kind of fancy. And I personally found it nice to have the baffles at the upper torso running like in line with my torso. So there is less of a down migration to the sides when, so to speak,
Mm,
the upper part of the quilt is lying on top of me. There isn't as much down migration to the sides that leaves my torso exposed. Whereas in the bottom area, I wanna I have like the different style of baffles that are like 90 degrees to my feet or to my legs, because I don't want any change in the sort of steps there. Whereas around the circumference, it doesn't matter as much how many down is at the feet area, like all around. Yeah, it makes it a bit tricky to explain for me, but I hope the point gets across. So I'm using horizontal ones at the bottom and like vertical ones, so to speak, at the top.
yeah, yeah. No, that makes a ton of sense because I mean, a lot of this is very personal for people, like how you sleep, how
Mm,
your sleeping pad works, what your sleep system is, and like what you're mentioning here, at least what I think I understand is that if you move around a whole lot, then you're going to want things to move to be lined up that way because you're going
yeah.
to when you're sleeping, you're going to move the down's going to move inside of your quilt, and it's going to shift as well. So you want to orient the baffles in a way that if the down does shift, then it's still keeping you warm. You're not moving it away from keeping you warm. Is that a line?
Yeah, perfectly right. So it's hard to think about it beforehand, but I personally found this type of baffle layout to work pretty fine for me. I didn't mention before, but I always put a horizontal baffle at the top as well, just to have a nice finishing edge, so to speak. But yeah, it works in the use pretty much exactly perfect because your feet will wiggle in a different way than your torso will, and so I find this type of patterning down and up differently to work perfect.
Yeah. One thing that just came to mind, Martin, is I'm curious about what sort of down movement you get from the partial baffles, or at least that's a
Mhm.
question I imagine people asking is if you don't run the baffles
Yeah.
all the way to the edge, then do you get more down movement throughout the quilt?
Yeah, I get that a lot actually. And it was a concern of mine at first, but having just felt how ridiculously strenuous it will be to distribute the down inside without a down adapter, yeah, which makes it a lot easier. But just by hand, just moving the down around in the quilt, it's really tricky to get it really through those tiny little gaps between the baffles. So there's not much that will move on its own, honestly. So it will like get you nearly the same benefits in terms of separation as the complete baffle. Yeah, without any downside.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I mean, I guess they call them clusters for other reasons, but down does kind of cluster together. They like
Yeah.
it's not
And they just catch on the edges of
right.
the baffle strips, and they don't just freely flow through it. It's yeah, it's not
Yeah,
water.
I guess in some ways you could argue that the partial baffles also saves weight.
Yeah, not a whole
Minimum.
bunch, but minimal. Like I guess it will be around 10 grams at most. But yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So the my next question is how do you weigh and then push the down into your quilt? Like your baffles are sewn, they're sewn to the top and the bottom materials, and now it's time to, you know, put the down clusters and the down feathers into your actual quilt. How do you evenly
Mhm.
spread out that down throughout the entire quilt to make sure you don't have these cold spots?
Yeah, like the first way I did it, or like with the first quilts, I just did it by hand, and it was really strenuous, so to speak. Just getting the down, pushing it in, trying to turn it, get it spread out evenly. And then I luckily found a 3D piece to print. It was from another maker. I can't remember the name honestly right now, but for a down adductor. So the down adductor is kind of a physical gimmicky thing. You have a contraption on top of a leaf blower in my case. So you have something that actually blowing air into the quilt. And because of a special nozzle type of design, it will, in the same time that it's blowing air into the quilt or into the garment, it will actually suck up the down through a different tubing. So it's a kind of crazy design, to be honest, and it works perfectly fine. So you actually will suck the down and blow it into the quilt. It's amazing how this works. It's kind of magic, and that makes working with down a lot easier. But well, you need a leaf blower of some kind, and you will need this adductor device. I will try to send you the link if I can find it, because this was just genius. And I mean, having it 3D printed somewhere isn't too hard nowadays, and it just makes working with down a lot easier.
That's so genius, because that's one of the things that stopped me from working with down is, I mean, we have a makerspace here. There is a room where I can make just about anything, and not too many people are worried because it's there for making. But because I'm in that room all the time, I just can't really get over the fact of like walking into that room and just having there be down clusters like floating everywhere for the next like 2 weeks. Because I've been in our down room in the shop, and it's just like we call it the saw bathroom, where it's just like you walk in and there's just like down floating through the air. And so having some control method is so smart.
Yeah, but still, just a warning, there will still be some down all over the place, because I mean, it's just the nature of things. The adductor works really well to really suck it up, but there will still be a loose bit of a cluster here and there that just goes somewhere else, and you will find it 3 years later in your bathroom. And yeah, it's just the way it down works, so to speak. There will be some loss in that regard.
That makes a lot of sense. So how do you choose what you suck up and then blow through the blower? Do you measure out certain amounts and put it into each baffle, or how do you determine how much down goes in each baffling?
Well, at first I did it that way, that there's some formula you can like sort of gauge how much down you will need for the amount of baffle and the size and volume of baffle you want to make. And that's how I did it at first. But especially with the partial baffles, I later went on to just think about how much down do I want to have in the whole quilt, for example, and then kind of directing the adductor inside the baffle stream and sort of sharing it inside the fabric this way, which makes it easier because you don't have to like perfectly nuancedly weigh the materials. Just get the overall weight and blow it into the quilt, so to speak, and then have it like sort of try and spread it evenly after the fact a little bit more. Yeah, but it will also be spread out quite well after the fact with the adductor. So yeah, the adductor makes everything easier, just to make it short.
No, that I could imagine that. What's the most common or most simple mistake that you see most people make, or that maybe you experienced yourself when you were making the quilts, and how do you avoid that mistake?
I guess a mistake I see made a lot, or I made myself at least a lot, was putting in too little down, because it is just annoying when you have like a little piece of baffle that is not filled completely. And so I tend to overfill heavily nowadays, just to make sure there's always enough down in there. Because, as I said before, even the treated down will degrade to some extent if it gets wet, and if you have just a bunch of overfill, it doesn't matter as much. And I mean, it's the best weight you can invest is down weight.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's a great point. That unlike most things where like if you just add miscellaneous fabric or components, that weight adds up really quickly. But if you like, for instance, a quilt that I just got an ounce of overstuff. For that reason, just the degradation of the down over time is going to be really minimal. But especially if you're doing it yourself and you may not be as precise as companies will when filling it, then overstuffing, you're just not really going to see much of a weight penalty at all, I guess. I mean, it's going to be grams at worst, right?
Yeah. And also, I mean, there's always the option to add it after the fact, but it's always a hassle to rip open the seams with those thinner materials to like don't make it a mess. And so I've just going the safe route, doing a well done overstuff on the project, and you will have more fun afterwards.
My last question before we get to Avery's last section is, what is your favorite baffling material? We forgot to talk about what to use as the material for baffling.
Basically, I use the lightest no-seam mesh, so the NS50, because I personally found it to be perfectly stable and strong for that purpose, and it's the lightest there is, and there's no downside in my books at least. So yeah, I found it really amazing for that purpose.
A little tidbit that you mentioned earlier was with the no seam baffling, it also has those little holes in it which the clusters can kind of grab, and to your point, that's actually a good thing that the clusters can kind of grab the baffle a little bit, keeps it in place, right?
Yeah, you're right. I didn't explain, because you could also do baffles with the same material as the shell, for example. But
right.
I mean, that would work, but why not use like the no-seam, which has the tiny holes, which also keeps the baffles in place a little, the down in place a little bit more with the same weight as the outer material, in fact. So yeah, just works splendid.
Yeah. Okay, Avery, I'm done for now.
No worries. We're wrapping up here and just going to touch on a few more questions. One question that I personally had was, do you recommend testing your quilt before going into the backcountry? I know it's one of those crucial life-saving pieces of gear. So how do you test it, and do you recommend testing it?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Before committing to a week-long trip or even a through hike or something, I definitely would test everything I make on a shorter section hike or day hike or something. I mean, with a quilt, you will need a night out, but still, I would always go and do it in a safe-ish environment where you can bail out if you made a mistake or if something happens. If it may not even be like the filling or anything that is wrong, but also there could be a tiny little sewing piece that will pop open and will ruin your trip in the worst case. So always making sure to give it a good test beforehand. And regarding the rating for a quilt, for example, or also the garments, there is a calculation depending on the loft of the material, which you can kind of gauge how warm it will be or to what degree Fahrenheit or Celsius it will keep you adequate. And well, there's two actually, because one for men and one for women, of course, because there's a little bit of a difference in the in the felt warmth or cold.
Yeah, that's a great point. I didn't even think of asking how do you know what degree your bag is once you make it. I mean, we know that there's with down like 800 fill power, 900 fill power, there's duck goose, there's down goose, not goose feathers, there's duck feathers, there's goose feathers. But yeah, I didn't think of like, how do you know if it's a 0 degree quilt or not? So that's if you have that resource, send it our way and we'll link it in the show notes.
So because the fill power won't determine the warmth in primarily, because it, in my opinion, it's mostly about the loft of the material and the materials itself, how warm the quilt will really be. And you can get to that amount of loft with lesser quality down, but just need more of it, or with the high quality down. And depending on this loft, you can really gauge which temperature range you will have.
Nice. So we've walked through pretty much all the steps of how to make a quilt and all of its nuances, but I have a question about care. So how do you take care of your down gear after a trip? And then how often are you washing it?
To be frank, I have never washed my down gear till now.
I support that.
Because, I mean, I didn't feel the need yet. I always make sure to really let it dry out after the fact. I mean, after a night where there maybe have been some condensation or something, I will try to have it air out. And also, at least when I'm at home, I will really spread it out, have it dry through, and have it sort of air out in that regard. And also store it with enough space so not to compress it down too much. And this process has worked fine for me so far, without any smell or any degradation that is too extreme.
I definitely feel that I didn't wash my quilt until after a through hike and then after almost 2 seasons of being a backpacking guide. But I also use a silk sheet, and being on long trips, that it just makes me feel cleaner. Like my bag feels cleaner on the inside. I'm not old sweat particles on it, and I know that like, you know, sweat can break things down, and if you have old sweat on your body and you're tossing and turning, you're getting like more oils and grime and stuff in your quilt. So I'm on the team of washing it very little. I've washed it once, but in my defense, I've also used a silk sheet, so I wash that more often, just so everyone knows.
Yeah, true.
One thing that we didn't talk about, so I just want to mention it before we end here, is what type of down you want to choose. I mean, there's 700, there's 650, 700, 750, 800, 850, like all up. What is your sweet spot, Martin, or what do you think is a sweet spot for the best quality, weight, warmth? What fill power do you like?
I would recommend go as high as you can reasonably afford, to be honest, because I personally found it's just nicer to work with higher quality down. And I don't know if it's true, but I hope, like with the Polish company, at least where I get my down, they are also RDS certified. And so I have a better feeling about how my down is produced, and it's worth maybe a little few more bucks for the weight or for the package, in terms of compared to like some cheaper down you may get from somewhere else or from China or something. I'd rather invest in the down, because it's basically what makes the quilt, and yeah, so have this one to be the best you can.
Yeah, there's something for everyone listening called the RDS, the Responsible Down Standard. Wherever you're purchasing down from, I would highly recommend trying to make, ensuring that it is RDS. Down is a byproduct from animals. It is more ideal to ensure that you're getting it in ethical and in good ways. Your down is going to be better off, but also the farming process of acquiring this down is interesting, and interesting depending on your use of the word, or kind of dark depending on how you want to go into it. But yeah, check out your down, make sure it's RDS certified, and just look into where your down is coming from. To Martin's point, finding a company that you know and you kind of trust and are able to believe in it is nice as well. But yeah, I think I've seen that a lot of your stuff, Martin, is 900 fill power, right? Most of your projects.
Yeah, that's the point I wanted to make. I'm trying to use the highest quality one, and you will need less of it, but have it still as lofty as I would have with more of the lower quality one. I mean, I've also worked with some 700 or 750 down in the past for some garments, for example. They don't need to be quite as high fill power, in my opinion, because you have just in general a lot less down you will need for a garment than a quilt. But still, it makes it easier or more ultralight, so to speak, to use the higher quality down, and you can just get a nicer warmth to weight ratio with that.
Yeah. Well, Martin, you've been a phenomenal resource. We really appreciate your time. I feel kind of inspired myself to try and go make a quilt now, and I really hope the listeners feel that way as well. So thank you for sharing all of your wisdom and experience. We really appreciate your time today.
Thanks. I was happy to help out, and I'm also happy to inspire other makers, because for me at least, it was amazing to see the response to my project or projects, and I'm always eager to share the knowledge and to have other guys like do stuff and have their own gear they really can be proud of. Yeah.
For anyone listening that doesn't know Martin already and hasn't seen his projects, then please go check him out on Instagram. Your Instagram, Martin, if I remember correctly, is Mont, MONTMOLAR. So Mont Molar, kind of a really cool name, by the way, a little ode to your dentistry as well as what you do. So yeah, go check out Martin and see his projects. He's a lot of stuff, way more than down. You do a lot more stuff than just down quilts, by the way. You're a great maker overall, but just want to focus on the quilt part today. So yeah, go check out Martin. And yeah, if you do make quilts, let us know. Send us a picture on Instagram, tag us, post it on Reddit. We're really excited to see what people are making. As always, please reach out to our help center if you have any questions about what materials you want to use, what down you want to use. If you want to see me make a quilt, let me know, and maybe I'll become even more inspired. Yeah, thanks for listening, everybody.